So I'm going to mute everybody and we'll get started. We, as usual, we'll do a little bit of review and then we'll get into what we're going to talk about tonight.
Yes.
Let me mute all.
You just put in the chat.
There you go. Let's start with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for the gift of your words, the ways that you choose to communicate with us, the ways that you choose to guide us and help shape us into the people you've made us to be. We ask that you bless us in this hour as we talk and learn and explore and maybe even raise more questions than we settle. We ask all these things in your son's name. Amen. So I have written down here to start with that same baby talk image, but I think you all get that one now. I think the point is that God speaking to us is a little bit like a fully grown, mature adult talking to an infant. There are no words that truly communicate what that adult knows to the baby, but through sounds and expressions and tone of voice, that baby hopefully knows that they're loved. And I think that's the image that David Hubbard, who wrote this, is going for. That the words of the Bible are God's way of trying to put His infiniteness into words that we can begin to understand. And so that's why we're exploring the history of the Bible, because not just the words of the Bible, but how the Bible came about, that those matter. And so we're going to do this to deepen our understanding of how the Bible came to us, but also we're going to do this to deepen our understanding of how God speaks to us through the pages of these books that are compiled into what we call the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, and how those came about, and some of the interesting story. I promise that weeks ahead, when we look at this one story of how an old manuscript was found, it reads like a spy novel, and it's a crucial story for how an important manuscript of the entire Bible was found. As always, we go just the basics so that these numbers are in your minds. The Bible's made up of 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. For the most part, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, and it comes from a Hebrew mindset. But after Alexander imposed Greek on everybody, we find ourselves with a Greek Old Testament called the Septuagint. That's important because it's the Old Testament that many of Jesus' contemporaries would know. The New Testament is written in a form of Greek called Koine Greek, Koine, and that just means common in Greek. It's the kind of Greek that was the common language across cultures, that was imposed on people, so that for business purposes and diplomacy, everybody could speak at least one of the same languages. The New Testament has been in its present form since the year 120. I can't say that enough because it counters the millions of copies of the Da Vinci Code that are out there that make a different claim. But even though there was a council late in the 4th century, in 397, in Carthage, oddly enough, where the Carthaginians are from, in Carthage, where the final 66 books were set as canon. And so we're still in the Old Testament in our conversation. And so I just want to summarize a little bit of where we've been. The earliest stories that we have in our Old Testament passed from person to person and generation to generation as an oral tradition. People memorize them, kids memorize them from their parents, and they pass them on to their children, and people read them in community. The scriptures, the account of God's interaction with people, it wouldn't have been called a Bible yet. Those stories were said as a regular part of community life. however big the town or village was, there would be pockets of people who would say these books together, and memorize them and pass them from generation to generation. For the most part, that worked until Israel divided into two kingdoms, and then one at a time, those two kingdoms were carted off into exile. And there may not have been the normal community rhythms in exile. And so people started to write these things down. And they wrote them down, of course, from memory, because it was an oral tradition. And they each wrote them with slight variations. After the exiles, those different versions were edited together into what we have as our first 5 books of the Old Testament and beyond, actually most of the Old Testament. And we talked about the theory of that talked about, that identified 4 individual sources. And there are a couple of ways you can identify these. They use different names for God. And the different names for God in Hebrew get translated into different words in different ways in English. And so I didn't bring one today, but if you have a Bible, you can look through any part of the Old Testament, and you'll see Lord all capitalized. Oftentimes in the Psalms that we put, or the Old Testament reading on Sunday, you'll notice that Lord is capitalized, all 4 letters, L-O-R-D. When Lord is capitalized like that in English, it means it's translating Yahweh from the Hebrew. When you see God, capital G and then a small O-D, what you're translating is the word Elohim, which is another Hebrew word for God. And then there is another word that shows up in the Old Testament in some places, which is Lord with a capital L, but the rest lowercase. And that's translating a word, a name for God that in Hebrew is Adonai. So some of you know old Christian songs that use some of those names. If you remember Amy Grant from the 80s and had a song called El Shaddai, El is short for Elohim, and it was God Almighty, El Shaddai. But in the rest of the song, it's El Elyon Adonai. She's using names for God in Hebrew in that song. And now you know what they look like in English. So you're a little bit ahead. I have more detail on that, but I'm wondering if that's not as crucial for us right now, other than to say that after the exiles were over, certainly after the exile of Judah, the southern kingdom where Jerusalem was, when they were allowed to come back, they compiled these written versions of the Old Testament and edited them together in what we have. It's why we have 2 creation stories in the first few chapters of Genesis. It's why some parts of the first 5 books of the Bible emphasize rules and regulations and the process of making sacrifices, and other parts tell stories about how the Jews wandered the Hebrews wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And each of these are taking stories from the different regional variations of these Old Testament stories, these Old Testament books. And to me, that just adds to the richness of those stories. It's not nearly as interesting if it plopped out of heaven in its final form. To me, it's interesting that people who were following God for centuries and then who were defeated in war and carted off as prisoners of war, they thought enough of the faith to record it in writing and to preserve it that way, and to try and make sure that later generations who couldn't memorize it by ear had it written down. And so all of this comes together a century or so before the coming of Jesus, just to set it in some historical context. Now, all of the different Jewish groups in the first century, around the time that Jesus came, read all of these things slightly differently, kind of like now. right? That shouldn't surprise you that that across a wide range of Jewish people in the first century, many of them read different things or emphasized different parts of their scriptures. That certainly happens now among Christians, so it shouldn't be a surprise. But there were some main groups that I think are important, because at the end of this little winding road here, we're going to get to an interesting story of how we got some very old Old Testament manuscripts. One of the Jewish groups that you see in the New Testament is the Pharisees. Jesus always seems to be going at it with the Pharisees, but it's important for they tend to be the villain in the New Testament stories. But the Pharisees were rabbis who faithfully and strictly followed the law and tried to enforce following the law on other people. But these were people of real spiritual depth who considered the scriptures important. They believed the promises. They believed in the resurrection of the body, that was a possible thing. And oftentimes, I think in their interactions with Jesus, they're trying to catch him in breaking one of those rules, because that's what they do. But it's not quite accurate to make them the pure villain of the New Testament story. There's another group, and this is oddly enough a group that was opposed to the Pharisees, called the Sadducees. I'm all of a sudden remembering a camp song. You know, the Pharisees weren't fair, the Sadducees were sad. I forget how that one goes. Now it's going to be stuck in my head. But the Sadducees were the elites that were tied to wealthy and powerful people in the first century, wealthy and powerful Jews in the first century. They considered themselves to be more educated and sophisticated than the others. They were in opposition to the religious fervor of the Pharisees. And they very much did not believe in resurrection after death. Those things end up being important, of course, after the resurrection, after the time when we believe Jesus was raised from the dead. Alongside these two sort of scholarly groups, there's a group called the Zealots. And we still use the word zealot, but not the way they did in the first century. The Zealots were first century Jews who were trying to create a revolution that would drive Rome out of the Holy Land. That's what they existed for. The Zealots launched what we would call now sort of guerrilla raids on Roman soldiers. For the military people here, they used asymmetrical warfare techniques. They did not just meet the Romans face to face. No one did that and lived, but you could sneak around and try and kill them or attack them in ways that did damage to them and attacked their morale. And that's what the Zealots did. They wanted to drive the Romans out of Judea, and they organized attacks in small groups. If I'm not mistaken, one of the 12 disciples is actually one of the Zealots, right? Is there not a Simon the Zealot that shows up somewhere? We can do that in the question and answer time. A subset of the Zealots was a group called the Sicarii. Now, the Sicarii, these were scary people. Sicarii, a Sicarus was a dagger. And the Sicarii used to keep their daggers hidden and move through crowds and assassinate Romans or Jews who were sympathetic to the Romans. Right now, the slang term in Latin America for a hitman is a sicario. And so this is another group that was making things difficult in the first century. This was a very, very much a militant, violent resistance to the Roman Empire. Like I said, they used to hide their knives under their cloaks. And one thing that I read today said that the whole phrase cloak and dagger came from the Sicarii in the first century. Other countries and leaders hired the Sicarii to assassinate their opponents. So they found gainful employment with their skill set. So the Zealots and Sicarii used to paint things on the walls in Jerusalem that said things like, "We must destroy the Roman Empire," or "We must destroy Jews who cooperate with the Roman Empire," or "We will kill all collaborators, no king but God." So this is the radical militant fringe of Judaism in the first century. And they're sort of alongside what is probably the largest group in the first century in Judaism, which is just regular Jews, just people who were of the Jewish faith and Jews by birth, who went about their daily business, practiced their faith, lived as best they could under Roman occupation, and weren't part of one of these identified groups or sects. Now, I saved the one we want to talk about for last. It is the most important group for understanding how our Old Testament came to be, or at least how our English Old Testament came to be. It's a group called the Essenes. Now, this requires a little bit of a story. In 1946, a little Bedouin shepherd boy was tending his flock of goats and started, as kids will do, started throwing rocks into caves. And he would hear the rock hit other rock and bounce, but he threw one and it smashed something. It sounded different. So not being an archaeologist, he threw a few more rocks and broke a few more things before he went up there and found huge repositories of scrolls, ancient scrolls, hidden in pottery, in large pottery vases. Like I'm going to show you some pictures of these. These are the caves that we're talking about here, because these still exist. They are a national park now in Israel. Do you see these holes here? These are the caves that the young shepherd boy walking here was throwing rocks into. And what he found, I've got another picture of caves. I'm not sure we need another picture of caves, but there you go. There's, this is what, see the people walking here, just to give you some scale. These were places where a group called the Essenes, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, kept their scriptures in the centuries before the first century. And so what they found in those tubes, those pots, were texts that look like this. Now, these are, and were instantly recognized to be, the oldest Hebrew scripture texts that anybody had found up to that point. Remember, Hebrew reads backwards, so it'll be adjusted right, and then the loose end will be at the left. I've got some closer pictures here of what these fragments looked like. Look at this. Thousands, and you can see where pieces of it had just aged and fallen apart. Thousands and thousands of these fragments, some of them big, and some of them not as big. They were, I'm going to find one more that I think just gives you an idea of, oh, here's what they looked like in the pots. Sorry, I stop share. There we go. Share. This is what they looked like when they found them. See these scrolls inside ceramic pots. And whatever the boy was throwing was breaking those. And that's how they found what they found. Just to give you an idea of what the work looks like with these scrolls. this is there are thousands and thousands of fragments like this and smaller that end up being crucial parts of Old Testament texts that we didn't know in forms this old before. And so that's what the little boy found. And it became a revolution of biblical study and biblical archaeology. And just to give you an idea of where this is near the top end of the Dead Sea. It's east of Jerusalem and south of Jericho. And the people who lived in those caves or in and around those caves, and actually some of their homes, the places that were carved out, dining rooms and everything carved out of the stone, are still there. You can visit these. They were ascetics. They lived very strict, self-deprived lives. Their whole day was made up of eating together, reading scripture together, spending hours and hours in prayer, a lot like monks now, but out in the desert with very little to that we would call creature comforts in their lives. The scrolls that they found weren't just biblical scrolls. You see rules that they lived by, daily meals and prayers, bathing rituals, and a description of good deeds. There was a 3-year-long probationary period to become an Essene. What makes them so important is that they had versions of the Hebrew Bible that dated as far back as 300 BC. Literally original, almost original manuscripts from 300 BC. That's roughly about the same time that Alexander the Great was conquering everything and imposing Greek on everyone. And that means that these texts were older and presumably more accurate than any of the texts that had been used for biblical translation up to that point. So the King James, all the Bibles that came out, the RSV came out in the 50s, it barely got to benefit from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Bibles since then have been corrected and amended based on these older manuscripts. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls had some of the oldest manuscripts of certain books of the Bible, and they had a description of the way that Second Temple Judaism was practiced. Remember, I said last week that Second Temple Judaism was the Judaism of the time of Christ. And so that's why it matters for us. How, what were the practices? What were the worship practices? What were the liturgies? Who was in and who was out? How was it ordered? All of that we found in the scrolls of the Dead Sea. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest versions of the Hebrew Bible were the Masoretic texts. Those were from the years 700 to 1000 AD. So some of these are literally more than 1,000 years older than anything that was known up to that point. There was an entire book of Isaiah. There were other copies of large sections of that book. There were pieces of every single book in the Old Testament except Esther. And one of the ideas is that if you know the story of Esther, she marries a Persian king. And it was thought that the Essenes thought that that was so offensive that they just removed that scroll from their collection. But a piece of every other Old Testament book was there. And so you've seen some of the slides. The Dead Sea Scrolls teach us something important about the way that ancient Jews read their Bible. Because what you found was different Bibles from different regions told similar stories, but using different words and images. And the reason that's important for us, we live in an era where the way Bible is read is by parsing every single small word, the way that a scientist would, putting the Bible under a microscope for precision. What they found with the Dead Sea Scrolls is that the old way of reading the Bible wasn't about precision. It was about getting the main point across in a way that was understandable to certain people at a certain time, in a certain place, with certain things that make sense to them. And that's a huge difference. That is not the way we have been taught in our generation to read the Bible. But the Dead Sea Scrolls teach us that there were lots of versions of Old Testament stories, some with different details, but the main point was the same. And that helps us understand how the scriptures were used then. This is an important part of the process of how the Bible came to be, how it came to be, how it continues to be sharpened and corrected. Because what happened with the Dead Sea Scrolls is that you took the best manuscript you had of, let's say, Isaiah, and they compared it to this one that was almost 1,000 years older. And you start to use a principle that is really important in the study of the Bible. Older manuscripts are better than newer ones. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but for the most part, if you've got a copy of Plato's Republic that was copied a couple of hundred years after Plato's death, and you have one that has been copied 50 or 100 more times and is 1,000 years younger than that, the oldest one is likely to be more accurate. It's an elaborate, much more complicated version of telephone, right? The game that you play when one person says something and they whisper it to the next person, and they whisper it all the way around the circle, and it's something completely different by the time you get to the end. The closer you are to the original source, the more likely you are to have something that's accurate. And so that is even more important with biblical manuscripts. So finding an older biblical manuscript corrects all the younger ones. And so the Bibles that we have now that have been printed in the last 20 or 30 years, those have access to older manuscripts for translation than the Bibles that were around 50 years or 100 years ago. Does that part make sense? That might seem like a tiny point, but I have this enormous respect for people, the scholars who work on these old manuscripts, sometimes little fragments, to try and make sure that we have the best and most accurate translations of Bibles in our own hands. And so, and that's important because we're part of a faith that goes back to the Stone Age. And really, we're part of a faith that has a written record that goes back to the Bronze Age in 1000 BC. And so if we're going to trust those documents that record the relationship between God and his human creation, then the more accurate documents, the more accurate our documents are, the better we can trust them to give an accurate reflection of what God is doing in our life and what God has done in the lives of people who are faithful to him over history. That older is better thing is, I'll be 60 next year, so older is better makes me happy. But the idea with scriptures is that if you've got an older manuscript, you can avoid translation errors and directions that the text wasn't meant to go originally. For those of you who've been to Italy, somewhere, I can't remember where this is, but there is a statue of Moses where he has horns, literally horns. I should have found this. You guys can Google it for yourselves. Moses with horns is a famous statue. And it's because of a bad translation that the sculptor had in his era that was corrected a generation later. So here he's reading his Bible and he's trying to figure out what kind of a statue he's going to do next. And he comes across a Bible verse that tells him that Moses had horns. And so that's the sculpture that he created, not knowing that it was a faulty translation, not something that was actually true. And so as we find these old manuscripts, they help us compile a more accurate reflection of what those original documents might have looked like. And so I can riff all day, as you know, on old things, but I think that's the important part here. It's that part of the compiling of the Bible originally means that it has to be reconstituted later on. So all those editors that put together the Old Testament from those different sources all around the Holy Land and from the people who were in exile, that happened, but 2,000 years has gone by. And so we're always in the process of trying to recompile those stories and those documents so that we have the most accurate Bible we can have. I'm going to leave it there. Next week, what we're going to do, I'm going to open it up for questions and conversation, but next week, we're going to look at the different kinds of writing in the Old Testament and how we can best read those kinds of writing, those kinds of literature. So I am going to unmute you and take a drink of water, and you guys can fire off some questions. Who's got a hand? I can't see. Oh, Tim, please. Oh, I think you're muted, Tim.
Yeah, we did find Simon the Zealot.
Okay.
And he was Sakari. Anyway, Margot and I were in Denver Museum. We got to see the Dead Sea Scrolls on display there.
Oh, wow.
And it was fascinating, but they were teeny tiny little print in tiny little fragments. And they had translations nearby of it. But a lot of, like you said, were rules and regulations of the community, leasehold interest,
right.
Anyway, it was fascinating, but
which gave a little bit different picture of the Essenes than some of history does.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that does not surprise me.
Yeah.
The only parts that they allow to travel are the small fragments.
Yeah.
And there are some I forget now where, but there are Azusa Pacific University down south has its own private collection of a few fragments. One of the things I read today that I'd forgotten about was that when they were first found, they were circulating on the open market. There's an ad in a New York newspaper, a classified ad selling pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls before they realized how influential and important they were going to be.
What kind of material are they written on?
They're written on the old important parchments would have been animal skin that was rolled out very thin.
Okay.
That picture that you showed where they were rolled up, I mean, did some of them sort of fall apart as you just unrolled them?
They did, yeah. Some were preserved better than others, depending on the sealing of the pot. I keep forgetting. I guess it's just a vessel is really what it is. It's kind of like an oblong tank, and some of them sat this way and some of them had fallen over, but they did find one entire intact, complete Isaiah in one of the caves.
Assembling the Dead Sea Scrolls.
yes,
John, there was years ago there was a PBS special on the discovery and examination. You probably could find it.
Yeah,
but you watch this from our perspective in 1946, but they had the windows open, people are smoking, they're using Scotch tape and they're putting it down. And you're like,
yeah. It's
anyway, that should be still available on their.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ask for it.
It's only in 1991 that wider access to the scrolls was granted to scholars. For 30 or 40 years, it was a small, they called them a cartel of biblical scholars who had access to the original manuscripts. Israel has entered into an agreement, I believe, with Google to photograph all of the scrolls and fragments and make them available for free.
Oh,
And so pretty soon that they'll all be out there. But yeah, Dale, is that your hand?
Yeah, it seems like it'd be more correct to say that we got the most like the original stories from the Dead Sea Scrolls, or from the earliest things. We get the most like the original, but not necessarily the most true. If we go by your principle that, as you mentioned, that there were various, originally the Jews told things in different ways.
Yeah.
And retained the same principles. So getting to be sure we got exactly what those scrolls said wouldn't necessarily be, I don't know, the best interpretation or the best communication of the word, as it were.
Well, I think my point is not older is perfect, but older is better.
Yeah.
And so there was a gathered collection of Greek manuscripts in the 16th century that was called the Textus Receptus. It was believed that this was the be all and end all, the closest and best you were ever going to get of Greek manuscripts. And the Textus Receptus is the Greek manuscript that was used to create the King James Bible. Well, in the centuries after that, older manuscripts were found in different places. And we'll talk about one eventually, but there in London, in the British Library, if you go to the one cool room on the ground floor that has everything from the Magna Carta to Beatles songs written on napkins. I mean, it has a little bit of everything. It also has the oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament. And it was found in a monastery in the Sinai. It's called Sinaiticus. And it's so important that it has its own little symbol when it gets footnoted in biblical translations. But it's, and it dates from the 4th century, from the 300s. So it's, now that, when that was discovered, corrected a lot of mistransmissions, is a better way to say than errors. Mistransmissions. And just so you know, just so you guys don't think I'm crazy here, well, you may already, but let me just show you this picture. And it's not just some piker of a sculptor. This was Michelangelo,
oh my God.
who carved Moses with horns because a mistransmission of an Exodus passage where Moses comes down from the hill and he's shining, you know, where he's seen the glory of God and his face is shining so much that no one can look at him. He has to cover his face. The mistranslation of shine came out as horns. And so there you got him. Michelangelo had the bad luck to make his statue of Moses while there was a bad translation on the market. And so just so you don't think I'm nuts, that still exists and people flock to see that.
Were there some other impressive corrections made?
I'm sure there are, and I only really have my go-to is Moses with horns.
Okay. I'll take that.
This is a test.
Yeah, I can look for some other ones, but for example, and Jack brought this up last week, and this is an Old Testament passage that had a huge impact on the way certain parts of the Christian story are told. So for years, we have been singing about round yon virgin mother and child, because this passage in Isaiah 7, am I right, Jack? Just nod somewhere in there, refers to a prophecy of the Messiah being born of a virgin. Well, as they got better at translating Hebrew, the word that they were translating really meant young woman. Now, you can see the inference in a very strict culture where you could say that, well, if she's a young unmarried woman, she's a virgin. But that's not what the word meant. It's how people chose to translate it. And so when the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, which I would guess, for those of you who grew up Presbyterian, it's probably the translation you grew up with. The RSV, which comes out in the early 50s, translated this word as young woman or young girl, not virgin. And literally all hell broke loose. I can't remember if I told you guys this story already here or if it was in the evangelicals class, but there was a preacher who was so incensed that it no longer said virgin that he tried to blowtorch the Bible in front of his congregation.
I can't believe it.
And when he couldn't get it to light, he said it's because it already came from the depths of hell. And so he couldn't light it. It had already been on fire.
Honestly.
So
Yeah.
I don't want to make too much light because, we all have our passages that are meaningful to us. But I think we all also have to be willing to change what we think when we find an older, better, more accurate, more faithful representation of the original. And so, Dale, you're right. It's not perfect, but the one that was that dates to 300 BC, just by logic, is going to be more accurate than the one that dates to 700 AD. That's 1,000 years difference. So even if the best monk ever copied it every single time from the year 300 to 700 AD, 300 BC to 700 AD, there are going to be mistakes in it. And so that's the point about the older manuscripts. I think I saw Steve. Did you have a hand up?
Yeah. What book of the Old Testament was it that had the
Thousand-year gap.
The horns.
No, the young woman.
That's
translation.
Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 7. I want to say it's 7:14 because I always associated it with Babe Ruth's home run record. But
yeah, but John, but what you could say to back up the conservative Christian is, okay, so Isaiah 7:14, young woman, but you could say, well, the young woman was a virgin.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah, that would be it's a cult, but then it's a cultural assumption and it's not a translation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that cultural assumptions are bad. Every single person here on my screen, including me, makes them. But we have to know we're making them when we make them.
Yeah.
I think that's the key.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah,
before
sure.
Ted, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to butt in front of him. What's the name of the earliest known complete New Testament?
It's Sinaiticus. So it's the word Sinai with okay, I'm going to geek out here, with a Latin adjective suffix on it. So it's Sinaiticus. So it's Sinaiticus, Ticus. And if you look it up, chances are you'll see this funky little letter, a one-letter graphic symbol. It has its own symbol. When you look into a Greek manuscript, it says this comes from Sinaiticus. Unless you've got a fragment that's older than that, Sinaiticus is the authority. but Sinaiticus is just the oldest complete collection. There are more than 5,000 fragments like the ones I just showed you of New Testament writings too, that are older than Sinaiticus. And in some places, they correct what's in Sinaiticus. So there are 3 old complete manuscripts. There's Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus. And you can just take the Latin endings off of all of them. The Sinaiticus was found in the Sinai. The Vaticanus resides in the Vatican because they own it. And Alexandrinus, it came from North Africa. And it was, I believe, it must have survived the fire at the Library of Alexandria.
And you know, John, if you have your Greek New Testament, now we had Nestle, okay?
Right.
And like you say, it's like if you're reading your RSV and you look at the bottom, you have all kinds of footnotes. Well, like in your Nestle Greek New Testament, as you know, as you took the course, okay, so you have all kinds of footnotes. They could have more than that.
Yeah.
You could have so many footnotes that you just had a little bit of the text.
That's
But what
right.
they do is they just have a few footnotes, but those footnotes are variants on the text.
Yeah.
So there's variants all over the place. But like you say, some of them will refer to the however you pronounce it.
Sinaiticus. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one fun thing is that the people who do this for a living, and God bless them, because I just could never do this. But Jack, did you go to Princeton?
Yes,
So did you have Bruce Metzger?
I did.
Yeah. So this guy, Bruce Metzger, who I was going to save and talk about later, and I still will, but
Yeah.
He knew all 5,000 of these fragments by
Oh,
heart.
Oh my God.
And is able to identify a monk in a certain time and place who made a mistake,
Yeah.
because that mistake gets repeated by everybody that used his manuscript. Remember, there's no printing press until the 1500s. So all of these things, the fact that they exist after a couple of thousand years of being copied by men and women, that's part of the story too. But Metzger identifies one monk in one place. He can probably identify the building
I'm trying to get
and the
Yeah.
mistake that he made, because it gets repeated through a whole region of, of Bibles. Sorry.
Yeah, can I just tell you a story about Bruce? Because I took a lot of courses from him, and believe it or not, he offered me a fellowship, but I just wanted to get out of school, so that was it. But anyway, he said, we had this class and we're reading our Greek New Testament, and we came to this word, and he said, gentlemen, because we just had all men there. He said, gentlemen, I believe that's the only place that's in this form in the whole New Testament. He knew the lexicon by heart. He goes, his eyes go like this. Yeah, yes, that's the only place in the whole New Testament. That was typical.
Just crazy. Mr. Erickson.
Yeah, you may have heard of this. It's a joke, but one of the monks apparently mistranslated. He wrote down celibate, but the correct word was celebrate.
Oh,
Oh,
What's that?
that's what a sad impact that had.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go any farther with that one. So again, another little technical conversation about how the Bible came about, but these are the stories that over time brought us the Bibles that are sitting in our homes and in the pews at church. It's a great story, and hopefully when we get to the actual literature of the Bible, you'll see it now through the lens of how much work went in, not just to writing these things down and preserving them and copying them and sharing them, but then also trying to preserve the accuracy of them and keep them safe. Did somebody, I saw a hand. Yeah, Tad, please.
So this is an easy one for you. The Council of Carthage.
Yeah.
Now, did those include our Old Testament plus the books of, I can't say it, the Apocrypha?
Ah, that's a good question.
So when you said 39 books, didn't it probably include some of the Apocrypha? And that's just a question. It's
Yeah.
not.
So there are, apart from the 39 books, well, apart from the 66 books of the Bible, there were other documents circulating alongside them. Some of them with varying degrees of accuracy, or what an artist would call provenance, right? Provenance, that you couldn't really trace this back to somebody who may have been the original author and may be who they said they were. And so there were all kinds of these books, and the councils every once in a while had to gather and decide which ones were in and which ones were out. But the church was already doing this for centuries by usage. And some of these, some of them were tossed out completely as being fanciful and not tied, not in the within the boundaries of the faith. Other ones got special designation. This is where church people, they never fail to figure out the longest word to use to describe something. But there is the Apocrypha, and most of you will know the word apocryphal, which means it's a story that can't be confirmed. You know, it's like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree is our apocryphal story. It's meant to kind of communicate something that we think is true, but we don't know if there was actually a cherry tree and an axe and a lie and all those things. And so there are books called the Apocrypha, and I can't remember which of the titles, and the Roman Catholic Church keeps those in the pages in between the Old and New Testament. There are other there's another collection of books called the Pseudepigrapha. And you just have to sort of back that one up and piece it together. Pseudo means false, right? And then the closest thing I can think of for the rest is, you know, an epigram when somebody writes like a dedication at the beginning of a book.
Mm-hmm.
So a pseudepigrapha, it's like, it's not the person who it says it is writing, but they're still ancient and they still teach us something, but they're not part of the canon. They're not part of the accepted 66 books. Even Roman Catholics don't consider the Apocrypha to be fully part of the canon, although they will preach from those books. And there are stories in those books that are valuable. I see your hand, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, are any of these rejected books those written by women?
Oh, no, I don't think that would have been a determiner. I see where you're headed with that, but
Written by what?
some of the written by women, if they were rejected because of or coincidental to the fact that they were written by women, I don't think so. There's one school of thought that thinks that the book of Hebrews was written by a woman. But it would be a woman steeped in Torah in the 1st century. And so there's no getting around the patriarchal origins and history of the church along the way. But for example, the Gospel of Thomas is one that was rejected. But one of the stories, somebody's going to correct me if I've got the wrong writing, but in one of the stories, Jesus as a teenager forms a bird out of mud and makes it fly. It's like Jesus doing magic tricks with his divinity. And I think the church wisely decided that probably wasn't one of the real stories and didn't belong in the canon.
Were there,
I'm sorry, I think I see Bert down there.
How about the book or the Gospel of Mary, the non-canonical?
Yeah, I don't know the Gospel of Mary. And so I don't know much about it. I'm happy to look it up. But anybody here read the Gospel of Mary? Yeah?
She lectures the other disciples, so they didn't think much of that.
I will say again that there is a temptation to look at this history as a straight line. that the church was hyper patriarchal in the beginning, and that we have worked our way to a more, at least in some church traditions, a more egalitarian tradition. That's not exactly how, that's not how real history goes with anything, but it's not how the history of the church has been. Paul refers in Romans 16 or 15 to a woman who was an apostle. And he clearly has women who are central to church leadership in the first century. But power being what power is, as soon as the church has to function in a patriarchal culture, it adopts more of the practices of the culture. So that it's not a straight line history, it's a wavy line history. Because at the moment that the fundamentalists are solidifying gender roles in American Christianity, the Quakers are doing the exact opposite. All part of the Christian family, just different expressions of how that goes. Have I rambled too much? That's
Right.
So we're at 8:01. So any pressing question on this stuff? We'll get to, I think next week, we're going to look at the whole Old Testament, the different kinds of literature that are in it. And maybe, well, if I get to it, we might see if we can identify them without knowing what book they're in. But that's a parlor trick that seminary students do, because we have to do it on the Bible content exam at some point. Let me close us in a word of prayer. Thanks for bearing with this. I think this is all the background we're going to see the rest of the Old Testament through. Let's pray together. God, thank you for the complexity of this story. It wouldn't be nearly as interesting if it was simple. We thank you that there are scholars and historians and archaeologists out there trying to help us have the best and most accurate understanding of your relationship with your people over time. We pray that we would absorb this and that it would become a part of our story too. We pray this in your son's name. Amen.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody.
Night.
See you Sunday.
Thanks, everybody. Right.